Hello, everybody. My name is Spencer Walsh, and on today's episode of Hidden History, we have a man trying to fight for his country and a dream of independence, a brutal late-night arrest, and horrific assassination, and one gold-capped tooth. That's right. On today's episode of Hidden History, we are taking you to Africa, specifically the Congo, long-time center of Belgium neo-colonialist and colonialist exploitation, where one man, Patrice Lumumba, tried his best to throw off the chains of the United States mining companies and, more deeply, the Belgian mining companies and the Belgian Free State and the long history of colonial oppression there. And we will take a look at the journey and the struggles, the many, many struggles that he had to deal with that, spoiler alert, ultimately cost him his life. I always feel kind of weird about, saying, because the whole point of the show is that people don't know what happened, telling them about what happened, informing them more about the history, hence hidden history. So, but spoiler alert, he died. A lot of people, I think we do get the idea is that a lot of people on the show, they end up, not doing too well, a la, Sukarno on the Indonesian episode that we did last week. Just one example, but he is a really kind of an important character. And to really understand and get into Patrice Lumumba and the Congo, we have to get back into the history of it. It's very, very important to kind of start with that. And really, it's been a long history of oppression, and it's really come from the basis is obviously in the neocolonial period when it comes to the scramble for Africa. The scramble for Africa was obviously the Berlin Conference. You may have learned about it. Think back to your history days, your high school history days, maybe. I don't know. I know I learned about it, but maybe some people didn't. I don't know how the Common Core education is all around. But it was essentially when all these European countries got together in Berlin and decided to divide and conquer Africa in the Berlin Conference in the 1880s. Essentially, this is when you hear about, they redraw all the borders in a way that, is only meant to benefit them. And they come in and, divvy the place up and essentially conquer it very easily. And they decided to throw to Brussels. They decided to throw to Belgium the Congo. So King Leopold was the guy at the time, and he was kind of separate from obviously the main Belgian government at the time. He was kind of the first one who really led the charge in the Congo on behalf of Belgium, and he was really quite brutal. He essentially established the Congo Free State, which is the name of it. For essentially, he controlled it, and he would sell it off and sell it out to both colonial. He would profit off of it, and he would sell it out to various Belgian companies, and sell it is really the entire country, and specifically the natural resource of at the time was rubber. You get rubber from the trees. You kind of tap the trees, and there were very, very strict rubber quotas and collections. Quotas for the the Congolese people to try and meet. And what happened if they did not enforce, essentially what happened if they didn't reach their quotas, if they didn't collect enough rubber from the trees in a certain amount of time, was essentially whatever the private companies wanted to happen. And a big part of it was, killing. And you were essentially, the punishment was death if you did not end up with the killing of, or if you do not end up with the certain amount of rubber that the boss wanted, and instead of and it was kind of a great benefit for the soldiers to say, look, we caught this guy, we got him not collecting his rubber, so much so that to prove they killed a certain unproductive Congolese slave, essentially, forced labor, whatever you want to call it. They had to cut off the right hand of the person and bring them home to show the bosses and say, look, hey, boss, we got this guy, not being productive enough, and they'd be like, oh, good job, and that was perfectly legal, perfectly acceptable. Sometimes even they would go as far as to, just cut off the hands of people who are already who are just doing fine and not kill them. The hand was sort of a trophy from the kill, but they would cut off the hands of people who they didn't even need to kill, because of the fact that, simply enough, that the bosses promised that if they killed enough people, they would be able to get home earlier. So that's kind of just the really just blatant disregard for human life and just lack of basic humanity that was very present in the Belgian Congo from all the way about the late 1800s and 1880s up until the 1960s when they got independence. And actually, fun fact, the U.S. was the first country to recognize the Belgians' claim to the land after the Berlin Congress. They then used the outrage over the crimes of Leopold, when that was kind of brought into the fore, to open Belgium up. They were really the ones who kind of brought that to the circle and say, hey, guys, Belgium under King Leopold is not doing a very good job. We have to put it off to the Belgian state, and the Belgian state then opens it up to U.S. mining interests. So by the time they get independence in the 1960s, the Congo, they have a lot of U.S. mining interests in there. They actually used Congolese uranium to make the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. So if you're getting ready to watch Oppenheimer, just know that came from kind of very exploited slave labor essentially in the Congo. So from then on, they were essentially set on the Congo. They had a direct strategic stake in the wealth of the Congo. So then, fast forward as we turn from the 1800s to the 1900s, we have the Cold War beginning to develop. And I don't know if you've been listening to the show or not, if this is your first episode, welcome, great to have you. But a big thing we talk about here on this show is the collection of natural resources, specifically who owns natural resources in various countries. A lot of the countries we talked about, we go from Iran with oil, Guatemala with fruit, and just the ability to just really land itself. It was a problem, right, in Guatemala. And look at Indonesia. That was some natural resources were at play there as well. It's just really also just general kind of control of the economy and ability to self-govern. Just that independence, that control over your own resources, control over your own destiny, and just having the ability to just have control over what happens as in your own borders as a government is a big thing that starts to gain prominence around this time. The post World War II era, the United States talking a big game about freedom, got a lot of these global South countries big ideas about self-determination. That was the key phrase, and they wanted to be able to control. This doesn't seem like the absolute most crazy ask. They wanted to control what happened inside their own borders. And they wanted to just reap the profits, reap the benefits from what their laborers had been tortured and been giving up really for free for centuries. This was no different in the Congo. Congo had tons of, as we talked about, rubber, but also tons of, every type of, precious metal, from cobalt to uranium to, all that kind of stuff was really, really present there in that part of the world. So in the Congo, there was a charismatic young beer salesman, who was a beer salesman at the time, named Patrice Lumumba, who was one of the people who wanted to see his country freed from Western influence. He was a son of a farmer from a tribe with a long history of colonial resistance and was denied access to formal education all his life. Lumumba learned from a local missionary and soon began to develop a major interest in politics. This is someone who really kind of came from nothing. It's very interesting to see which type of people, the backgrounds where they come from, these certain leaders, and where they come from and how that affects how they govern. And it's a very interesting kind of study with Lumumba because he's the perfect experience from. Congolese experience, I guess, at the time, because he comes from living the Congolese dream, I guess you could say. So he comes from, again, a poor farmer with a long history of kind of resistance to the colonial regime. He gets taught to read and write by a Christian missionary, which he is very grateful for. Gets more of a political sense about his country, gets a sense about what is being done to the country and who specifically is doing it, and coming up on some more pretty dangerous, politically dangerous ideas about how to stop what's being done to the country. he was again denied really formal access to education all by his entire life, really. So he then, now that he knows how to read and write, gets a little bit of education, gets a little bit interested into politics, stuff like that, starts to get opinions about what's going on in the world. He decides to go to the big city. That is the capital city of what was then called Leopoldville, and now is called Kinshasa. He now worked then as a postal worker and joined the nationalist movement and rose pretty fast. This was at the time it was a party called Abaco. And it was a party that was relatively marginal in terms of what was really Belgian dominated Congolese politics. They were kind of moderate. They weren't doing anything too far too fast. They were doing much more regional focused type of action. And it was something that he wasn't the most thrilled with. But he was charismatic. He was a good speaker and was able to rise pretty quickly for self-determination, with its calls for self-determination and social justice resonating quite deeply with the people of the city. He was a fierce critic of, obviously, the Belgian forced labor system, which still remained in part in the country. He was then arrested for political reasons by the Belgian authorities for participating in a nationalist protest. But from there, his stature grew even more. In kind of a funny way that we've seen a lot of other times throughout history. He was kind of seen as a martyr with a little bit of extra kind of street cred, essentially. They must have really thought it was a big deal if they were willing to come in and arrest him and put him in prison for just attending a protest and things like that. That was a big part of the story. But for not just for Lumumba, he began to not just be focused on freeing Congo from the chains of the Belgians, but more focused on a broader African project. Over time, and especially as his stature grew in the context of the movement for independence within the Congo, Lumumba began to become a bigger supporter of Pan-Africanism, which is obviously the idea that Africa should in some way, either politically or socially, in some ways more strong than others, it kind of differed, unite around a common kind of redistributive left-wing ideology of both social justice and economic justice, control over your own resources, and really do that by combining a lot of resources, maybe combining some borders and unifying. Even the term the United States of Africa was thrown around by, I believe, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. And over this time, Lumumba was actually invited to a conference called the All African People's Conference, hosted by Kwame Nkrumah himself in 1958. The conference was a major turning point for African independence, with multiple countries then pushing for and successfully winning independence in a pretty big way. That was pretty shocking to a lot of people, as we saw, kind of countries from around the area, pushing kind of in the direct wake of the this conference, the All African People's Conference. We had some Guinea win independence from France. We got Cameroon winning independence from both the French and British Empire in January of 1960 and October of 1961. Togo, Mali, Senegal, Madagascar, Somalia, Dahomey. I'm definitely saying that wrong. Oh my God. I apologize to all the people there. Benin, Niger, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Chad, Central African Republic, Republic of Congo, Gabon, all of these places in the 1960s. Nigeria, Mauritania, Sierra Leone. Excuse me. Something about Sierra Leone gets me going, I guess. But anyway, it was a pretty important, pretty successful time for African independence. And as Lumumba began to see that other countries were getting their independence, they were getting their big win, and the DRC was not. So that led him to kind of criticize more the existing Abaco party that he, again, said was just not being fast enough in terms of independence, which was a pretty big deal. he gave the Congolese a kind of a banner to rally around and kind of an independence turning point when he eventually formed for the first time away from the traditional kind of Bako party, which had become less and less popular, especially kind of correlated to the rise in popularity of Lumumba and his supporters. He formed the MNC, or the Congolese National Movement was the name of it. It was the new kind of political party that really, I think, made things serious, kind of at a time really kind of a united front organization that was really dedicated to achieving independence within a reasonable time and bringing together members from a variety of political backgrounds in order to achieve independence. And they had pretty substantial support in the whole of Congo, while most other parties, again, like Abako, were severely limited by their abilities and kind of their to only really appeal to certain provinces in what was at the time a pretty divided country. So especially as they began to grow more and more popular, the Belgian authorities kind of unsurprisingly cracked down, and this was really their worst fear. After years and years of viewing these people as think about all the way back to King Leopold. With the cutting off of their hands, they viewed these people as just there to serve them, viewing them as probably below people in general, really not, kind of considering them, not giving them that level playing field in their eyes, just this kind of really awful, sadistic, subhuman worldview. And, it was really, really clear that was just, not going to stand for them for a while. And especially this kind of united kind of nationalist front was not going to stand for the Belgians, and they really began to crack down, arresting Lumumba again, and really, arresting, kind of harassing and suppressing, through beating people up at rallies, the whole 9 yards, and just using the violence of the incredibly violent Belgian colonial state to essentially ensure that things were going to be suppressed and be brought under control by the, essentially the Congolese wouldn't get too uppity at that time. That was their perception. But by 1960, independence from Belgium was finally secured after decades of agitation, and a national election was held. So, independence after a long day, a long series of actions and protests and violence and stuff like that, and a lot of pressure from internal and external sources. Belgians say, okay, we're going to give you your independence, and the transfer of power takes place. At that time, independence had already been won, and Patrice Lumumba at this time had won the election as prime minister, going away. It really was not particularly close returns. And even the next closest party was actually, I believe. Yeah, the two parties were the Abako party, which is also won independence. The two second closest parties were the Abako party, which won independence, and second place was the PSA, which is the openly socialist party that also obviously advocated for independence. But Lumumba comes in, unites the whole country in a very effective way, beats his next closest opponent by 11 percentage points. And he comes in to this big event. This all comes as the Belgians are leaving. They have this grand ceremony in the hotel where the old king of the Congo, essentially a Belgian puppet, makes a big speech where in this very fancy hotel with all the Belgian dignitaries and the bigwigs inside and the Congolese listening on loudspeakers outside. He gave the first speech in which he praised the genius of his ancestor, King Leopold II, who began the colonization of the Congo on his own initiative in the 1880s. He depicted the end of colonial rule as the culmination of the Belgian civilizing mission and spoke of the close relations he hoped would be maintained between the two countries, essentially saying, guys, let's not screw this up. Belgium, it's a very kind of paternalistic, let's not screw this up. We've given... we've been giving a great chance. Let's prove that we can govern ourselves and we're not, stupid, savage animals, essentially, just playing into all the kind of racist tropes of the colonial period. Then Kasavubu, who is the president that was going to be the head of state alongside Lumumba as prime minister, makes a short, kind of uncontroversial speech, but then it is Lumumba's turn. He taps Joseph Kasongo, who is the president of the Chamber of Deputies, who was presiding over the ceremonies, newly elected. And he invited Lumumba to give an address as Lumumba had requested him to do so. It was unscheduled. He was like, hold up. I can't take that. And he just he's calling the King Leopold II a genius. I'm not going to take that lying down. So he gets up there and he makes a speech. It is in the French language, so we can't really, unfortunately, hear it directly, but it sounded like this. I ask you to mark this, June 30th, 1960. An illustrious date that you will keep indelibly engraved in your hearts. A date of significance of which you will proudly teach to your children, so that they will make known to their children and grandchildren the glorious history of our struggle for freedom. The Republic of the Congo has been proclaimed, and our country is now in the hands of its own children. Together, my brothers and sisters, we are going to begin a new struggle. Although this independence of the Congo is being proclaimed today by agreement with Belgium, an amicable country with which you are on equal terms, no Congolese will ever forget that independence was won in struggle, a persevering and inspired struggle carried on from day to day, a struggle in which we were undaunted by privatization or suffering and stinted neither strength nor blood. It was filled with tears, fire, and blood. We are deeply proud of our struggle because it was just and noble and indispensable in putting an end to the humiliating bondage forced upon us. That was our lot, for 80 years of colonial rule, and wounds are too fresh and much too painful to be forgotten. We've experienced forced labor in exchange for pay that didn't allow us to satisfy our hunger, to clothe ourselves, to have decent lodgings, or to bring up our children as dearly loved ones. Morning, noon, and night, we were subjected to jeers, insults, and blows because we are Negroes. Who will ever forget that the black was addressed as tu, not because he was a friend, but because the polite vous was reserved for the white man? We have seen our lands seized in the name of ostensibly just laws, which gave recognition only to the right of might. We have not forgotten that the law was never the same for the black and the white, that it was lenient to the ones, and cruel and inhuman to the others. We have experienced the atrocious sufferings, being persecuted for political convictions and religious beliefs, and exiled from our native land. Our lot was worse than death itself. We have not forgotten that in cities, the mansions were for whites and the tumble-down huts for the blacks, that a black was not admitted to the cinemas and restaurants and shops set aside for Europeans, that a black traveled in the holes under the feet of the whites in their luxury cabins. Who will ever forget the shootings which killed so many of our brothers, or the cells into which we were mercilessly thrown, those who no longer wish to submit to the regime of injustice, oppression, and exploitation used by the colonialists as a tool of their domination? All that, my brothers, brought us untold suffering. But we who are elected by the votes of your representatives of the people to guide our native land, we who have suffered in the body and soul of the from the colonial oppression, we tell you that henceforth all that is finished with. The Republic of the Congo has been proclaimed, and our beloved country's future is now in the hands of its own people. Saying we will not forget, and we are in control. Some of the main messages of the speech, and boy, let me tell you, that pissed a lot of people off, especially a lot of the people in that same room. It was, very disturbing to some people across the pond in a little town called Langley. And certainly a lot of disturbing to people in Brussels who also had a lot of economic interest in the country and did not want to see what they all, had to know was going to come, which was a pretty massive drive to change things in a pretty big way. So, it was stunning shock for Belgium and Belgians after the MNC, Lumumba's party, won the election, when they really expected the nationalist. They expected not the nationalists. They expected the moderate PNP, the Belgian-backed PNP, to win. Lumumba, though, obviously inherited a pretty deeply ethnically, religiously, and regionally divided country, facing heavy resistance from Belgian companies and the colonial state who didn't want to part with their natural resources. He knew that was going to come true, but Lumumba's attempt to assert true independence economically, not just, political independence, we're good, we're not technically having Belgian troops in there anymore, that wasn't good enough for Lumumba. He knew that Belgian companies and United States companies and Western companies just in general were still going to have a major role to play in the Congo because they had so many of their interests, their economic interests, and their tied to natural resource in the Congo, which, as long as they were there, I think Lumumba correctly assumed that there was no possible way to really secure true independence. This, though, was going to be unacceptable to Belgians who still felt like they owned the place. He also planned to expand Pan-Africanism. But his efforts to fight the problems and build power put him at odds with the Belgian elite and the military. In the first few months, he implemented major nationalization policies of many of the key heavy metal mines in the country owned by Belgian and United States companies. He saw home control of resources as the only way to assert true sovereignty and spur economic development. He redistributed land to small-scale farmers and respected traditional land rights, attacking poverty and inequality in a direct attack on the control of the Belgians. This, again, as we see in the past, nationalization of industry, that's what got Iran. And this next one, land reform, was a big thing that redistributing land to small-scale farmers was what got Guatemala's Jacobo Arbenz. And Lumumba, in a very short period of time, did them both. He also increased standard access to education and emphasized instruction in indigenous languages. This was a direct attack. It's so hard to not, it's so important to emphasize this. This was a direct attack on what Belgium thought they were getting, that they're getting, and really what they were used to. They were used to dominating these people, and they had truly, finally had enough. Lumumba's short time as prime minister was one where Congolese people could begin to imagine a country finally, after centuries, that they could control themselves. The divisions and economic challenges were going to be a given, but they came to a head when the resource-rich province of Katanga seceded from Greater Congo. Katanga was led by Moise Tshombe, who was supported by the Belgian state and companies who still had economic interests in the region, as well as some of the southern African white-ruled states that had not yet received their independence. It was also supported by the United States, who feared a communist turn, sometimes comparing, in a pretty interesting way, the Lumumba to a African Fidel Castro, saying this is going to go just the way of Cuba, which was almost, you can kind of think of it, was our Belgium. We had so much resources there. We had sugar plants. We had the mafia. We had our fingers so deep into that island. Fidel Castro kind of kicked us out, and we never really have been able to live it down the same. We tried to kill him for years and years and years, but he obviously died, an old man in his bed, by all accounts. But yeah, so Lumumba, he tried to negotiate peacefully with these secessionists, trying to make some concessions, but obviously opposed the secession as principles. So it's important to have those resource-rich parts of the country within the country. Otherwise, really, what good is your independence? But the puppet Tshombe and his backers, Tshombe and his backers, who saw their wedge to break the new Lumumba coalition in two. So they knew that this secession was going to be the thing that could really destabilize and hamstring the government, and they felt it. Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General, was asked by Lumumba to send in some troops because it was viewed as an act of aggression, the supporting the secessionist movement, which is clearly at the time people knew this was being backed by Belgium, was being a big problem. Lumumba goes to Hammarskjöld in the UN, hey, can you please stop this? He was like, we'll send troops in, but only really, quote unquote, keep the peace. They essentially did nothing. They turned to the United States. They were rejected. Not a big surprise there. Then they turned to the Soviet Union. This was a pretty controversial move due to the negative attention it would attract, but arguably they needed it to deal with the powerful separatist movement. The CIA freaked at this time because then they really were sure, just like it was going to be the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again, and they needed to take some action. Eisenhower wanted to prove his anti-communist bona fides, and supported by, and this is kind of the early 60s, kind of just as Kennedy is getting elected in late 1960, he comes in just as, to put it one way, shit is going down for Lumumba. So Eisenhower, who obviously wants to prove his anti-communist bona fides in the wake of the Red Scare, and people like the Dulles brothers begin to plan this operation. They'd been monitoring Lumumba for a while, and according to released documents, they saw this as the urgent and prime objective for their, regime change department, to put it a little bit bluntly. Soviets then sent advisors and planes to the Congo, but the United States, meanwhile, had persuaded a young colonel, Mobutu, to take charge. He promptly ousted the radical politicians and expelled the Soviet advisors, placing Patrice Lumumba under house arrest. He escaped, though, Lumumba did, and fled to Stanleyville, but along the way, he made small speeches, kind of stopping off in towns, rallying to supporters, saying, hey, we got this, hang in there. Probably not the best idea, I'm going to be real. But he was then seized during the escape and handed over by Mobutu to Moise Tshombe and the Katangan separatist province. He was imprisoned illegally, and the UN ignored and vetoed efforts to free him or put him up on trial. Katangan authorities then took him and two aides out one night before a firing squad shot them, presumably many, many times, buried them in shallow graves, but they were later dug up, and their bodies were dissolved in acid. The gold tooth, Patrice Lumumba's last remains, were returned to the Congo after he was obviously killed by Katangan separatists and Belgian mercenaries, is the best information we really have on that. The gold tooth, that was all that remained of Lumumba's body, was returned to the Congo by Belgium in 2022. But it's pretty clear to see and it's important to highlight here, the major role the CIA actually had in really architecting the plot. Only days after Lumumba's visit to Ghana, this is way back when he was, still talking to Kwame Nkrumah, pre-independence, Larry Devlin, the agency's leading man in the Congo, warned his bosses of a vague takeover plot involving the Soviets and Guineans, as well as the Guineans, as well as the local Communist Party. It was difficult to determine the major influencing factors, he said. Despite a complete lack of evidence, he said he was certain that the decisive period when the Congo would align itself with the Soviet Union was not far off. Soon after, Dwight Eisenhower verbally ordered the CIA to assassinate Lumumba. The CIA's agents did not, in the end, man the firing squad to kill Lumumba, but as Williams makes clear, this is a researcher about this, the distinction is minor when one considers everything else the agency did to assist in the murder. After inventing and disseminating a bogus conspiracy plot of a pro-Soviet takeover, the CIA leveraged its multitude of sources in Katanga to provide intelligence to Lumumba's enemies, making his capture possible. They helped him to deliver him to the Katanga prison, where he was held before his execution. There's even been a few lines from a recently declassified CIA expense report to show that Devlin, again the station chief, ordered one of his agents to visit the prison not long before the bullets were fired. Maybe they didn't man the firing squad, but they were certainly watching from maybe the sidelines after having essentially led Lumumba into this trap. A short-lived separatist group of supporters of Lumumba took hold for about a year. That was quickly crushed. But the murder of Lumumba and his replacement by the U.S.-backed dictator Mobutu Sese Seko laid the foundation for, similar to Guatemala, decades of internal strife, dictatorship, and economic decline that have marked the post-colonial Congo. The stabilization of the Congolese society under Mobutu's brutal rule, lasting from 1965 to 1997, culminated in a series of devastating conflicts known as the First and Second Congo Wars, or Africa's World Wars. Those conflicts not only fractured Congolese society, but also engulfed nearly all the country's neighbors, ultimately involving 9 African nations and around 25 armed groups. By the formal end of the conflict, around 2003, nearly 5.4 million people had died in the fighting. 5.4 million, making the war the world's second deadliest conflict since World War II. And it's hardly ever discussed. And that is one of the key things and, one of the common themes, just as we see huge amounts of destabilization in governments at critical times when democracy is really flourishing, stamped out by the CIA and by the United States, who had a really, really big role in this. It's important to say the Belgians had a big role as well, kind of guiding, opposition forces to, Lumumba within the Congo. But, we see the United States here popping up again and again, crushing democracy, really when it counted, and sending regions into decades and decades of war, violence, chaos, disease, death, and stuff that they really have not been able to recover from. That is something that is so, so important in understanding our history, and why I thank you so, so much for listening to this episode. I hope you find yourself better informed about the nature of U.S. empire and what our actions have done as they have reverberated around the world, causing immense amounts of suffering, pain, and death. Thank you so much for listening. We're going to be back next week. It's in history.